do the intro?
You're on.
It's all me?
Yeah.
All right then. So welcome to the second part of the Midnight Library. On page 23, our note begins, Dear whoever, I had all the chances to make something of my life, and I blew every one of them. Through my own carelessness and misfortune, the world has retreated from me. And so now it makes perfect sense that I should retreat from the world. If I felt it was possible to stay, I would, but I don't, and so I can't. I make life worse for people. I have nothing to give. I'm sorry. Be kind to each other. Bye, Nora. 0 o'clock. At first, the mist was so pervasive that she could see nothing else, until slowly she saw pillars appear on either side of her. She was standing on a path, some kind of colonnade. The columns were brain gray, with specks of brilliant blue. The misty vapors cleared like spirits wanting to be unwatched, and a shape emerged, a solid, rectangular shape. The shape of a building, about the size of a church or a small supermarket. It had a stone facade, the same coloration as the pillars, with a large wooden central door and a roof which had aspirations of grandeur, with intricate details and a grand-looking clock on the front gable, with black painted Roman numerals and its hands pointing to midnight. Tall, dark-arched windows, framed with stone bricks, punctuated the front wall, equidistant from each other. When she first looked, it seemed there were only 4 windows, but a moment later, there were definitely 5 of them. She thought she must have miscounted. As there was nothing else around, and since she had nowhere else to be, Nora stepped cautiously towards it. She looked at the digital display of her watch. 0 o'clock. 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. Midnight, as the clock had told her. She waited for the next second to arrive, but it didn't. Even as she walked closer to the building, even as she opened the wooden door, even as she stepped inside, the display didn't change. Either something was wrong with her watch, or something was wrong with time. In the circumstances, it could have been either. What's happening? She wondered. What the hell is going on? Maybe this place would hold some answers, she thought as she walked inside. The place was well lit, and the floor was light stone, somewhere between light yellow and camel brown, like the color of an old page. But the windows she'd seen on the outside weren't there on the inside. In fact, even though she'd only taken a few steps forward, she could no longer see the walls at all. Instead, there were bookshelves. Aisles and aisles of shelves reaching up to the ceiling and branching off from the broad open corridor Nora was walking along. She turned down one of the aisles and stopped to gaze in bafflement at the seemingly endless amount of books. The books were everywhere, on shelves so thin they might as well have been invisible. The books were all green, greens of multifarious shades. Some of these volumes were a murky swamp green, some a bright and light chartreuse, some a bold emerald, others the verdant shade of summer lawns. On the subject of summer lawns, despite the fact that the books looked old, the air in the library felt fresh and had a lush, grassy, outdoors kind of smell, not the dusty scent of old tomes. The shelves really did seem to go on forever, straight and long towards a far-off horizon, like lines indicating one-point perspective in a school art project, broken only by the occasional corridor. She picked a corridor at random and set off. At the next turn, she took a left and became a little lost. She searched for a way out, but there was no sign of an exit. She attempted to retrace her steps towards the entrance, but it was impossible. Eventually, she had to conclude she wasn't going to find the exit. This is abnormal, she said to herself, to find comfort in the sound of her own voice. Definitely abnormal. Nora stopped and stepped closer to some of the books. There were no titles or author names adorning the spines. Aside from the difference of shade, the only other variation was size. The books were of similar height, but varied in width. Some had spines 2 inches wide, others significantly less. 1 or 2 weren't much more than pamphlets. She reached to pull out one of the books, choosing a medium-sized one in a slightly drab olive color. It looked a bit dusty and worn. Before she had pulled it clean from the shelf, she heard a voice behind her, and she jumped back. "Be careful!" the voice said, and Nora turned around to see who was there. The librarian. "Please, you have to be careful." The woman had seemingly arrived from nowhere, smartly dressed with short gray hair and a turtle green polo neck jumper. About 60 if Nora had to pin it down. "Who are you?" But before she had finished the question, she realized she already knew the answer. "I'm the librarian," the woman coyly said. "That is who." Her face was one of kind but stern wisdom. She had the same neat, cropped gray hair she'd always had, with a face that looked precisely as it always did in Nora's mind. For there, right in front of her, was her old school librarian. "Mrs. Elm." Mrs. Elm smiled thinly. "Perhaps." Nora remembered those rainy afternoons playing chess. She remembered the day her father died when Mrs. Elm gently broke the news to her in the library. Her father had died suddenly of a heart attack while on the rugby field of the boys' boarding school where he taught. She was numb for about half an hour and had stared blankly at the unfinished game of chess. The reality was simply too big to absorb at first, but then it had hit her hard and sideways, taking her off the track she'd known. She'd hugged Mrs. Elm so close, crying into her polo neck until her face was raw from the fusion of tears and acrylic. Mrs. Elm had held her, stroking and smoothing the back of her head like a baby, not offering platitudes or false comforts or anything other than concern. She remembered Mrs. Elm's voice telling her at the time, "Things will get better, Nora. It's going to be all right." It was over an hour before Nora's mother came to pick her up, her brother stoned and numb in the back seat. And Nora had sat in the front next to her mute, trembling mother, saying that she loved her, but hearing nothing back. "What is this place? Where am I?" Mrs. Elm smiled a very formal kind of smile. "A library, of course." "It's not the school library, and there's no exit. Am I dead? Is this the afterlife?" "Not exactly," said Mrs. Elm. I don't understand." "Then let me explain." As she spoke, the Midnight Library. As she spoke, Mrs. Elm's eyes came alive, twinkling like puddles in moonlight. "Between life and death, there is a library," she said, "and within that library, the shelves go on forever. Every book provides a chance to try another life you could have lived, to see how things would be different if you had made other choices. Would you have done anything different if you had the chance to undo your regrets?" "So I am dead?" Nora asked. Mrs. Elm shook her head. "No, listen carefully. Between life and death." She gestured vaguely along the aisle towards the distance. "Death is outside." "Well, I should go there because I want to die." Nora started walking. But Mrs. Elm shook her head. "That isn't how death works." "Why not?" "You don't go to death. Death comes to you." Even death was something Nora couldn't do properly, it seemed. It was a familiar feeling, this feeling of being incomplete in just about every sense. An unfinished jigsaw of a human, incomplete living, incomplete dying. So why am I dead? Why has death not come to me? I gave it an open invitation. I wanted to die, but here I am, still existing. I am still aware of things. Well, If it's any comfort, you are possibly about to die. People who pass by the library usually don't stay long one way or the other. When she thought about it, and increasingly she had been thinking, Nora was only able to think of herself in terms of the things she wasn't, the things she hadn't been able to become. And there really were quite a lot of things she hadn't become, the regrets which were on permanent repeat in her mind. I haven't become an Olympic swimmer. I haven't become a glaciologist. I haven't become Dan's wife. I haven't become a mother. I haven't become the lead singer of the Labyrinths. I haven't managed to become a truly good or truly happy person. I haven't even managed to look after Voltaire. And now, last of all, she hadn't even managed to become dead. It was pathetic, really, the amount of possibilities she had squandered. While the Midnight Library stands, Nora, you will be preserved from death. Now you have to decide how you want to live. The moving shelves. The shelves on either side of Nora began to move. The shelves didn't change angles, they just kept on sliding horizontally. It was possible that the shelves weren't moving at all, but the books were, and it wasn't obvious why or even how. There was no visible mechanism making it happen, and no sound or sight of books falling off the end, or rather the start of the shelf. The books slid by at varying degrees of slowness, depending on the shelf they were on, but none moved fast. What's happening? Mrs. Elm's expression stiffened and her posture straightened, her chin retreating a little into her neck. She took a step closer to Nora and clasped her hands together. It's time, my dear, to begin. If you don't mind my asking, begin what? Every life contains many millions of decisions, some big, some small. But every time one decision is taken over another, the outcomes differ. An irreversible variation occurs, which in turn leads to further variations. These books are portals to all the lives you could be living. What? You have as many lives as you have possibilities. There are lives where you make different choices, and those choices lead to different outcomes. If you had done just one thing differently, you would have a different life story. And they all exist in the Midnight Library. They are all as real as this life. Parallel lives? Always parallel. Some are more perpendicular. So, do you want to live a life you could be living? Do you want to do something differently? Is there anything you wish to change? Did you do anything wrong? That was an easy one. Yes, absolutely everything. The answer seemed to tickle the librarian's nose. Mrs. Elm quickly rummaged for the paper tissue that was stuffed up the inside sleeve of her polo neck. She brought it quickly to her face and sneezed into it. Bless you, said Nora, watching as the tissue disappeared from the librarian's hands the moment she'd finished using it, through some strange and hygienic magic. Don't worry, tissues are like lives. There are always more. Mrs. Elm returned to her train of thought. Doing one thing differently is often the same as doing everything differently. Actions can't be reversed within a lifetime, however much we try. But you are no longer within a lifetime. You've popped outside. This is your opportunity, Nora, to see how things could be. This can't be real, Nora thought to herself. Mrs. Elm seemed to know what she was thinking. Oh, it is real, Nora seed, but if not quite reality as you understand it, for want of a better word, it is in between. It is not life, it is not death. It is not the real world in a conventional sense, but nor is it a dream. It isn't one thing or another. It is, in short, the Midnight Library. The slow-moving shelves came to a halt. Nora noticed that on one of the shelves to her right, at shoulder height, there was a large gap. All the other areas of the shelves around her had the books pressed tightly side by side, but here Lying flat on the thin, white shelf, there was only one book, and this book wasn't green like the others. It was gray. As gray as the stone of the front of the building when she'd seen it through the mist. Mrs. Elm took the book from the shelf and handed it to Nora. She had a slight look of anticipatory pride, as if she'd handed her a Christmas present. It seemed light when Mrs. Elm was holding it, but it was far heavier than it looked. Nora went to open it. Mrs. Elm shook her head. You always have to wait for my say-so. Why? Every book in here, every book in this entire library except one, is a version of your life. The library is yours. It is here for you. You see, everyone's lives could have ended up an infinite number of ways. These books on the shelf are your life, all starting from the same point in time. Right now, midnight, Tuesday, the 28th of April. But these midnight possibilities aren't the same. Some are similar, some are very different. This is crackers, said Nora, except one. This one. Nora tilted the stone gray book towards Mrs. Elm. Mrs. Elm raised an eyebrow. Yes, that one. Something you have written without ever having to type a word. What? This book is the source of all your problems and the answer to them too. But what is it? It's called, my dear, the Book of Regrets. The Book of Regrets. Nora stared at it. She could see it now, the small typeface embossed on the cover, the Book of Regrets. Every regret you have ever had since the day you were born is recorded in here, Mrs. Elm said, tapping her finger on the cover. I now give you permission to open it. As the book was so heavy, Nora sat down cross-legged on the stone floor to do so. She began to skim through it. The book was divided into chapters chronologically arranged around the years of her life. 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 35. Chapters got much longer as the book progressed year by year, but the regrets she accumulated weren't specifically related to that year in question. Regrets ignore chronology. They float around space. The sequence of these lists changes all the time. Ah, right, yes, that makes sense, I suppose. She quickly realized they ranged from the minor and quotidian, I regret not doing any exercise today, to the substantial. I regret not telling my father I loved him before he died. There were continual background regrets which repeated on multiple pages. I regret not staying in the labyrinths because I let down my brother. I regret not staying in the labyrinths because I let down myself. I regret not doing more for the environment. I regret the time I spent on social media. I regret not going to Australia with Izzy. I regret not having more fun when I was younger. I regret all those arguments with Dad. I regret not working with animals. I regret not doing geology at university instead of philosophy. I regret not learning how to be a happier person. I regret feeling so much guilt. I regret not sticking at Spanish. I regret not choosing science subjects in my A-levels. I regret not becoming a glaciologist. I regret not getting married. I regret not applying to do a master's degree in philosophy at Cambridge. I regret not keeping healthy. I regret moving to London. I regret not going to Paris to teach English. I regret not finishing the novel I started at university. I regret moving out of London. I regret having a job with no prospects. I regret not being a better sister. I regret not having a gap year after university. I regret disappointing my father. I regret that I teach piano more than I play it. I regret my financial mismanagement. I regret not living in the countryside. Some regrets were a little fainter than others. One regret shifted from practically invisible to bold and back again, as if it was flashing on and off right there as she looked at it. The regret was, I regret not yet having children. That is a regret that sometimes is and sometimes isn't, explained Mrs. Elm, again, somehow reading her mind. There are a few of those. From the age of 34 onwards, in the longest chapter at the end of the book, there were a lot of Dan's specific regrets. These were quite strong and bold and played in her head like an ongoing fortissimo chord in a Haydn concerto. I regret being cruel to Dan. I regret breaking up with Dan. I regret not living in a country pub with Dan. As she stared down at the pages, she thought now of the man she had so nearly married. Regret overload. She'd met Dan while living with Izzy in Tooting. Big smile, short beard, visually a TV vet. Funny, curious, he drank quite a bit, but always seemed immune to hangovers. He had studied art history and put his in-depth knowledge of Rubens and Tintoretto to incredible use by becoming head of PR for a brand of protein flapjacks. He did, however, have a dream. And his dream was to run a pub in the countryside, a dream he wanted to share with her, with Nora. And she got carried away with his enthusiasm, got engaged, but suddenly she realized she didn't want to marry him. Deep down, she was scared of becoming her mother. She didn't want to replicate her parents' marriage. Still staring blankly at the book of regrets, she wondered if her parents had ever been in love, or if they got married because marriage was just something you did at the appropriate time with the nearest available person. A game where you grabbed the first person you could when the music stopped. She'd never wanted to play that game. Bertrand Russell wrote that to fear love is to fear life, and those who fear life are already 3 parts dead. Maybe that was her problem. Maybe she was just scared of living. But Bertrand Russell had more marriages and affairs than hot dinners, so perhaps he was no one to give advice. When her mom died 3 months before the wedding, Nora's grief was immense. Though she had suggested that the date be put back, it somehow never was. And Nora's grief fused with depression and anxiety and the feeling that her life was out of her own control. The wedding seemed such a symptom of this chaotic feeling that she felt tied to a train track, and the only way she could loosen the ropes and free herself was to pull out of the wedding. Though in reality, staying in Bedford and being single and letting Izzy down about their Australia plans and starting work at String Theory and getting a cat had all felt like the opposite of freedom. "Oh no," said Mrs. Elm, breaking Nora's thoughts. "It's too much for you." And suddenly she was back, feeling all this contrition, all that pain of letting people down and letting herself down, the pain she had tried to escape less than an hour ago. The regrets began to swarm together. In fact, while staring at the open pages of the book, the pain was actually worse than it had been wandering around Bedford. The power of all the regrets simultaneously emanating from the book was agony. The weight of guilt and remorse and sorrow too strong. She leaned back on her elbows, dropped the heavy book, and squeezed her eyes shut. She could hardly breathe, as if invisible hands were around her neck. "Make it stop!" "Close it now," instructed Mrs. Elm. "Close the book, not just your eyes, close it. You have to do it yourself." So Nora, feeling like she was about to pass out, sat back up, placed her hand under the front cover, and felt even heavier now. But she managed to close the book and gasped in relief. Every life begins now. Well, Mrs. Elm had her arms folded. Though she looked identical to the Mrs. Elm Nora had always known, her manner was definitely a little more brusque. It was Mrs. Elm, but also somehow not Mrs. Elm. It was quite confusing. "Well, what?" Nora said, still gasping, still relieved she could no longer feel the intensity of all her regrets simultaneously. "Which regret stands out? Which decision would you like to undo? Which life would you like to try on?" She said that precisely, try on, as if this was a clothes shop and Nora could choose a life as easily as a t-shirt. It felt like a cruel game. That was agony. I felt like I was about to be strangled. What is the point of this? As Nora looked up, she noticed the lights for the first. Just naked bulbs hanging down from wires attached to the ceiling, which seemed like a normal kind of light gray ceiling. Except it was a ceiling that reached no walls, like the floor here. It went on forever. The point is, there is a strong possibility that your old life is over. You wanted to die, and maybe you will. And you still need somewhere to go, somewhere to land, another life. So you need to think hard. This library is called the Midnight Library because every new life on offer here begins now, and now is midnight. It begins now, all these futures. That's what is here. That's what your books represent. Every other immediate present and ongoing future you could have had. So there are no pasts in there. No, just the consequence of them. And those books are also written. And I know them all, but they are not for you to read. And when does each life end? It could be seconds, it could be hours, or it could be days, months, more. If you found a life you truly want to live, then you get to live it until you die of old age. If you really want to live a life hard enough, you don't have to worry. You will stay there as if you had always been there. Because in one universe, you have always been there. The book will never be returned, so to speak. It becomes less of a loan and more of a gift the moment you decide you want that life, really want it. Then everything that exists in your head now, including this midnight library, will eventually be a memory so vague and intangible, it will hardly be there at all. One of the lights flickered overhead. The only danger, continued Mrs. Elm more ominously, is when you're here. Between lives. If you lose the will to carry on, it will affect your root life, your original life. And that could lead to the destruction of this place. You'd be gone forever, you'd be dead, and so would your access to all this. That's what I want. I want to be dead. I would be dead because I want to be. That's why I took the overdose. I want to die. Well, maybe or maybe not. After all, you're still here. Nora tried to get her head around this. So how do I return to the library if I'm stuck in a life even worse than the one I've just left? It can be settled, but as soon as disappointment is felt in full, you'll come back here. Sometimes the feeling creeps up. Other times it comes all at once. If it never arrives, you'll stay put and you'll be happy there. By definition, it couldn't be simpler. So, pick something you would have done differently, and I will find you the book. That is to say, the life. Nora stared down at the Book of Regrets lying closed on the yellow-brown floor tiles. She remembered chatting late at night with Dan about his dream of owning a quaint little pub in the country. His enthusiasm had been infectious, and it had almost become her dream, too. I wish I hadn't left Dan, that I was still in a relationship with him. I regret us not staying together and working towards that dream. Is there a life where we're still together? Of course, said Mrs. M. The books in the library began to move again, as though the shelves were conveyor belts. This time, though, instead of going as slow as a wedding march, they moved faster and faster and faster until they couldn't really be seen as individual books at all. They just whirred by in streams of green. Then just as suddenly, they stopped. Mrs. Elm crouched down and took a book from the lowest shelf to her left. The book was one of the darker shades of green. She handed it to Nora. It was a lot lighter than the Book of Regrets, even though it was a similar size. Again, there was no title on the spine, but a small one embossed on the front, precisely the same shade as the rest of the book. It said, "My life." But it's not my life. Oh, Nora, they are all your lives. What do I do now? You open the book and you turn to the first page. Nora did so. Okay, said Mrs. Elm with careful precision. Now read the first line. Nora stared down and read. She walked out of the pub into the cool night air. And Nora had just enough time to think to herself, pub? After that, it was happening. The Text began to swirl and soon became indecipherable in fast motion as she felt herself weaken. She never knowingly let go of the book, but there was a moment where she was no longer a person reading it, and a consequent moment where there was no book or library at all. The Three Horseshoes. Nora was standing outside in crisp, clean air. But unlike in Bedford, it wasn't raining here. Where am I? She whispered to herself. There was a small row of quaint stone terraced houses on the other side of the gently curving road. Quiet old houses with all their lights off, nestled at the edge of a village before fading into the stillness of the countryside. A clear sky, an expanse of dotted stars, a waning crescent moon, the smell of fields, the two-way twit-twoo of tawny owls, and then quiet again. Quiet that had a presence, that was a force in the air. Weird. She had been in Bedford, then in that strange library, and now she was here on a pretty village road without hardly even moving. On this side of the road, gold light filtered out of a downstairs window. She looked up and saw an elegantly painted pub sign creaking softly in the wind. Overlapping horseshoes underneath carefully italicized words. The Three Horseshoes. In front of her, there was a chalkboard standing on the pavement. She recognized her own handwriting at its neatest. The Three Horseshoes, Tuesday night quiz night, 8:30 p.m. True knowledge exists in knowing that you know nothing. Socrates, after losing our quiz. This was a life where she put 4 exclamation points in a row on a sign. That was probably what happier, less uptight people did. A promising omen. She looked down at what she was wearing, a denim shirt with sleeves rolled halfway up her forearms and jeans and wedge-heeled shoes, none of which she wore in her actual life. She had goosebumps from the cold and clearly wasn't dressed to be outside for long. There were 2 rings on her ring finger. Her old sapphire engagement ring was there, the same one she'd taken off through trembles and tears over a year ago, accompanied by a simple silver wedding band. Crackers! She was wearing a watch, not a digital one in this life, an elegant, slender, analog one with Roman numerals. It was about a minute after midnight. How is this happening? Her hands were smoother in this life. Maybe she used hand cream. Her nails shone with clear polish. There was some comfort in seeing the familiar small mole on her left hand. Footsteps crunched on gravel. Someone was headed towards her down the driveway. A man, visible from the light of the pub windows and the solitary steel street lamp. A man with rosy cheeks and gray Dickensian whiskers and a wax jacket and Toby mug made flesh. He seemed, from his overly careful gait, to be slightly drunk. Good night, Nora. I'll be back on Friday. For the folk singer, Dan said he's a good one. In this life, she probably knew the man's name. Right, yeah, of course, Friday. It should be a great night. At least her voice sounded like her. She watched as the man crossed the road, looking left and right a few times, despite the clear absence of traffic, and disappearing down a lane between the cottages. It was really happening. This was actually it. This was the pub life. This was the dream made reality. This is so very weird, she said into the night. So very weird. A group of 3 left the pub then too, 2 women and a man. They smiled at Nora as they walked past. We'll win next time, one of the women said. Yes, replied Nora, there's always a next time. She walked up to the pub and peeked through the windows. It seemed empty inside, but the lights were still on. That group must have been the last to leave. The pub looked very inviting, warm and characterful, small tables and timber beams, and a wagon wheel attached to a wall. A rich red carpet and a wood-paneled bar full of an impressive array of beer pumps. She stepped away from the window and saw a sign just beyond the pub, past where the pavement became grass. Quickly, she trotted over and read what it said. Littleworth welcomes careful drivers. Then she noticed that the top center of the sign, a little coat of arms around which orbited the words Oxfordshire County Council. We did it, she whispered into the country air. We actually did it. This was the dream Dan had first mentioned to her while walking by the Seine in Paris, eating macarons they had bought on the Boulevard Saint-Michel. A dream not of Paris, but of rural England where they would live together, a pub in the Oxfordshire countryside. When Nora's mom's cancer aggressively returned, reaching her lymph nodes and rapidly colonizing her body, that dream was put on hold, and Dan moved with her from London back to Bedford. Her mom had known of their engagement and planned to stay alive long enough for the wedding. She had died 4 months too soon. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the life. Maybe this was first time lucky or second time lucky. She allowed herself an apprehensive smile. She walked back along the path and crunched over the gravel, heading towards the side door the drunken, whiskery man in the wax jacket had recently departed from. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. It was warm and quiet. She was in some kind of hallway or corridor, terracotta floor tiles, low wood paneling, and above, wallpaper full of illustrations of sycamore leaves. She walked down the little corridor and into the main pub area, which she had peeked at through the window. She jumped as a cat appeared out of nowhere. An elegant, angular chocolate Burmese purring away. She bent down and stroked it and looked at the engraved name on the disc attached to the collar. Voltaire. A different cat with the same name. Unlike her dear beloved Ginger Tabby, she doubted this Voltaire was a rescue. The cat continued to purr. Hello, Volts number 2. You seem happy here. Are we all as happy as you? The cat purred a possible affirmation and rubbed his head against Nora's leg. She picked him up and went over to the bar. There was a row of craft beers on the pumps, stouts and ciders and pale ales and IPAs. Vicar's favorite, Lost and Found, Miss Marple, Sleeping Lemons, Broken Dream. There was a cherry tin on the bar for butterfly conservation. She heard the sound of clinking glass, as if a dishwasher was being filled. Nora felt anxiety constrict her chest, familiar sensation. Then a spindly 20-something man in a baggy rugby top appeared from behind the bar, hardly giving any attention to Nora as he gathered the last remaining used glasses and put them in the dishwasher. He switched it on, then pulled down his coat from a hook, put it on, and took out some car keys. Bye, Nora. I've done the chairs and wiped all the tables. Dishwasher's on. Thanks. Till Thursday. Yes, said Nora, feeling like a spy about to have her cover blown. See you. A moment after the man left, she heard footsteps rising up from somewhere below, heading across the tiles she had just walked down, coming from the back of the pub, and then he was there. He looked different. The beard had gone. There were more wrinkles around his eyes, dark circles. He'd nearly finished a pint of dark beer in his hand. He still looked a bit like a TV vet, just a few more series down the line. Dan, she said, as if he was something that needed identifying, like a rabbit by the road. I just want to say I'm so proud of you, so proud of us. He looked at her blankly. Was just turning the chiller units off. Got to clean the lines tomorrow. We've left it a fortnight. Nora had no idea what she was talking about, and she stroked the cat. Right, yes, of course, the lines. Her husband, for in this life that was who he was, looked around at all the tables and upside-down chairs. He was wearing a faded Jaws t-shirt. Have Blake and Sophie gone home? Nora hesitated. She sensed he was talking about people who worked for them. The young man in the baggy rugby top was presumably Blake. There didn't seem to be anyone else around. Yes, she said, trying to sound natural despite the fundamental bizarreness of the circumstances. I think they have. They were pretty on top of things. Cool. She remembered buying him the Jaws t-shirt on his 26th birthday 10 years previously. The answers tonight were something else. One of the teams, the one Pete and Jolie were on, thought Maradona painted the Sistine ceiling. Nora nodded and stroked Volt's number 2, as if she had any idea who on earth Pete and Jolie were. To be fair, it was a tricky one tonight. Might take them from another website next time. I mean, who actually knows the name of the highest mountain in the Kara-What's-It range? Karakoram, Nora said? That would be K2. Well, obviously you know, he said a little too abruptly, a little too tipsily. The kind of thing you would know, because while most people were into rock music, you were into actual rocks and stuff. Hey, she said, I was literally in a band. A band she remembered then Dan had hated her being in. He laughed. She recognized the laugh, but didn't entirely like it. She'd forgotten how often during their relationship, Dan's humor hinged on other people, specifically Nora. When they'd been together, she'd tried not to dwell on this aspect of his personality. He'd had so many other aspects. He had been so lovely to her mom when she was ill, and he could talk at ease about anything. He was so full of dreams about the future. He was attractive and easy to be around. He was passionate about art and always stopped to chat to the homeless. He cared about the world. A person was like a city. You couldn't let a few less desirable parts put you off the whole. There may be bits you don't like, a few dodgy side streets and suburbs, but the good stuff makes it worthwhile. He had listened to a lot of annoying podcasts that he thought Nora should listen to and laughed in a way that grated on her, gargled loudly with mouthwash. And yes, he hogged the duvet and could occasionally be arrogant in his opinions on art and film and music, but there's nothing overtly wrong with him. Well, now that she thought about it, he'd never been supportive of her music career and advised her that being in the labyrinths and signing a music deal would be bad for her mental health, and that her brother was being a bit selfish. But at the time, she'd viewed that not so much as a red flag, but a green one. Her thinking was, he cared, and it was nice to have someone who cared, who wasn't bothered about fame and superficialities, and could help navigate the waters of life. And so when he asked her to marry him in the cocktail bar on the top of the Oxo Tower, she'd agreed, and maybe she'd always been right to agree. He stepped forward into the room, placed his pint down momentarily, and was now on his phone looking up better pub quiz questions. She wondered how much he'd drunk tonight. She wondered if the dream of owning a pub had really been a dream of drinking an endless supply of alcohol. What's the name of a 20-sided polygon? I don't know, Nora lied, not wanting to risk a similar reaction to the one she'd received a moment ago. He put the phone in his pocket. We did well, though. They all drank loads tonight. Not bad for a Tuesday. Things are looking up. I mean, there's something to tell the bank tomorrow. Maybe they'll give us an extension on the loan. He stared at the beer in his glass, swilled it around a little, and downed it. But I've got to tell AJ to change the lunch menu. No one in Littleworth wants to eat candied beetroot and broad bean salad and corn cakes. This isn't pissing Fitzrovia. And I know they're going down well, but I think those wines you chose aren't worth it, especially the California ones. Okay. He turned and looked behind him. Where's the board? What? The chalkboard. Thought you brought it in. So that was what you'd been outside for. No, I'm going to do it now. Thought I saw you go out. Nora smiled away her nerves. Yes, well, I did. I had to. I was worried about our cat, Voltaire. I couldn't find him, so I went outside to look for him and found him, didn't I? Dan was back behind the bar, pouring himself a scotch. He seemed to sense she was judging him. This is only my third, fourth, maybe. It's quiz night. You know I get nervous doing the comparing, and it helps me be funny. And I was funny, don't you reckon? Yes, very funny. Total funniness. His face fell into serious mode. I saw you talking to Erin. What did she say? Nora wasn't sure how best to answer this. Oh, nothing much. The usual stuff. You know Erin. The usual stuff? I didn't think you'd ever spoken to her before. I meant the usual stuff that people say, not what Erin says. Usual people stuff. How's Will doing? Really well, he says. Hi, Nora guest. Dan's eyes pop wide with surprise. Really? Nora had no idea what to say. Maybe Will was a baby. Maybe Will was in a coma. Sorry, no, he didn't say hi. Sorry, I'm not thinking. Anyway, I'll go and get that board. She put the cat down on the floor and headed back out. This time she noticed something she'd missed on entering. A framed newspaper article from the Oxford Times with a picture of Nora and Dan standing outside the Three Horseshoes. Dan had his arm around her. He was wearing a suit she'd never seen before. And she was in a smart dress she never would have worn. She rarely wore dresses in her original life. Pub owners make dream a reality. They had, according to the article, bought the pub cheaply and in a neglected state and then renovated it with a mix of a modest inheritance, Dan's, and savings and bank loans. The article presented a success story, though it was 2 years old. She stepped outside, wondering whether life could really be judged from just a few minutes after midnight on a Tuesday, or maybe that was all you needed. The wind was picking up, standing out on that quiet village street. The gust pushed the board a little along the path, nearly toppling it over. Before she picked it up, she felt a buzz from a phone in her pocket. She hadn't realized it was in there. She pulled it out, a text message from Izzy. She noticed that her wallpaper was a photo of herself and Dan somewhere hot. She unlocked the phone using facial recognition and opened the message. It was a photo of a whale rising high out of the ocean, the white spray soaking the air like a burst of champagne. It was a wonderful photo, and just seeing it caused her to smile. Izzy was typing. Another message appeared. This is one of the pics I took yesterday from the boat. Another message. Humpback mother. Then another 2 photos. 2 whales this time, their backs breaking the water. With calf. The last message also included emojis of whales and waves. Nora felt a warm glow, not just from the pictures, which were indisputably lovely, but from the contact with Izzy. When Nora backed out of her wedding to Dan, Izzy had insisted that she come to Australia with her. They'd mapped it all out, a plan to live near Byron Bay, get jobs on one of the whale-watching boat cruises. They'd shared lots of clips of humpback whales in anticipation of this new adventure. But then Nora had wobbled and backed out, just like she backed out of a swimming career, and a band, and a wedding. But unlike those other things, there hadn't even been a reason. Yes, she'd started working at string theory, and yes, she felt the need to tend to her parents' graves, but she knew that staying in Bedford was the worst option. And yet, she picked it. Because of some strange predictive homesickness that festered alongside a depression that told her, ultimately, she didn't deserve to be happy. That she had hurt Dan, and that a life of drizzle and depression in her hometown was her punishment. And she hadn't the will or clarity or hell, the energy to do anything. So in effect, she swapped her best friend for a cat. In her actual life, she'd never fallen out with Izzy, nothing that dramatic. But after Izzy had gone to Australia, things had faded between them until their friendship became just a vapor trail of sporadic Facebook and Instagram likes and emoji-filled birthday messages. She looked back through the text conversations between her and Izzy and realized that even though there were still 10,000 miles between them, they had a much better relationship in this version of things. When she returned to the pub, carrying the sign this time, Dan was nowhere to be seen, so she locked the back door and waited a while in the pub hallway, working out where the stairs were, and unsure if she actually wanted to follow her tipsy sort of husband up there. She found the stairs at the rear of the building through a door that said staff only. As she stepped on the beige raffia carpet, heading towards the stairs, just after a framed poster of Things You Live and Learn in the Dark, one of their favorite Ryan Bailey movies, which they had watched together at the Odeon in Bedford, she noted a smaller picture on a sweet little windowsill. It was their wedding photo, black and white, reportage style, walking out of a church into a shower of confetti. It was difficult to see their faces properly, but they were both laughing, and it was a shared laugh. And they seemed, as far as a photograph can tell you anything, to be in love. She remembered her mom talking about Dan. He's a good one. You're so lucky. Keep hold of him. She saw her brother, Joe, too, shaven-headed, looking genuinely happy, champagne glass in hand, and a short-lived, disastrous investment banker boyfriend, Louis, by his side. Izzy was there, and Ravi, too, looking more like an accountant than a drummer, standing next to a bespectacled woman she'd never seen before. While Dan was in the toilet, Nora located the bedroom. Although they often evidently had money worries, the nervous appointment with the bank confirmed that. The room was expensively furnished. Smart window blinds, a wide, comfortable-looking bed, the duvet crisp and clean and white. There were books either side of the bed. In her actual life, she hadn't had a book by her bed for at least 6 months. She hadn't read anything for 6 months. Maybe in this life, she had a better concentration span. She picked up one of the books, Meditation for Beginners. Underneath it was a copy of a biography of her favorite philosopher, Henry David Thoreau. There were books on Dan's bedside table, too. The last book she remembered him reading had been a biography of Toulouse-Lautrec, Tiny Giant. But in this life, he was reading a business book called Zero to Hero, Harnessing Success in Work, Play, and Life, and the latest edition of The Good Pub Guide. She felt different in her body, a little healthier, a little stronger, but tense. She patted her stomach and realized that in this life she worked out a bit more. Her hair felt different too. She had a heavy fringe, and feeling it, she could tell her hair was longer at the back. Her mind felt a little woozy. She must have had at least a couple glasses of wine. A moment later, she heard the toilet flush, then she heard gargling. It seemed to be a bit noisier than necessary. "Are you all right?" Dan asked when he came into the bedroom. His voice, she realized, didn't sound like she remembered. It sounded emptier, a bit colder. Maybe it was tiredness. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was beer. Maybe it was marriage. Maybe it was something else. It was hard to remember exactly what he sounded like before, what he had been like precisely, but that was the nature of memory. At university, she'd done an essay dryly titled The Principles of Hobbesian Memory and Imagination. Thomas Hobbes had viewed memory and imagination as pretty much the same thing. And since discovering that, she had never entirely trusted her memories. Outside the window, the street lamp's yellow glow illuminated the desolate village road. "Nora, you're acting strange. Why are you just standing in the middle of the room? Are you getting ready for bed, or are you doing some kind of standing meditation?" He laughed. He thought he was funny. He went over to the window and pulled the curtains. Then he took off his jeans, put them on the back of a chair. She stared at him and tried to feel the attraction she'd once felt so deeply. It seemed to require a Herculean effort. She hadn't expected this. Everyone's lives could have ended up an infinite number of ways. He collapsed heavily on the bed, a whale into the ocean, picked up Zero to Hero, tried to focus, put it down, picked up a laptop by the bed, shoved an earphone in his ear. Maybe he was going to listen to a podcast. I'm just thinking about something. She began to feel faint, as if she was only half there. She remembered Mrs. Elm talking about how disappointment in a life would bring her back to the library. It would feel, she realized, altogether too strange to climb into the same bed with a man she hadn't seen for 2 years. She noticed the time on the digital alarm clock, 12:23. Still with the earphone in his ear, he looked at her again. Right, listen, if you don't want to make babies tonight, you can just say, What? I mean, I know we'll have to wait another month till you're ovulating again. We're trying for a baby? I want a baby? Nora, what's with you? Why are you strange today? She took off her shoes. I'm not. A memory came to her related to that Jaws t-shirt. A tune, actually. Beautiful Sky. The day she had bought Dan the Jaws t-shirt had been the day she had played him a song she had written for the Labyrinths, Beautiful Sky. It was, she was convinced, the best song she'd ever written. And more than that, it was a happy song to reflect her optimism at that point in her life. It was a song inspired by her new life with Dan, and he had listened to it with a sluggish indifference that had hurt at the time, and which she would have addressed if it hadn't been his birthday. Yeah, he'd said, it's okay. She wondered why that memory had stayed buried, only to rise up now like the great white shark on his fading t-shirt. There were other things coming back to her too now. His over-the-top reaction when she'd once told him about a customer, Ash, the surgeon and amateur guitar player who came into string theory for the occasional songbook, casually asking Nora if she'd wanted to go for a coffee sometime. Of course I said no. Stop shouting. Worse, though, was an A&R man for a major label, or rather, a boutique former indie label with Universal behind them, wanted to sign the Labyrinths. Dan had told her it was unlikely they'd survive as a couple. He'd also heard a horror story from one of his university friends who'd been in a band that signed to a label, and then the label ripped them off, and they'd all become unemployed alcoholics or something. I could take you with me, she said. I'd get it in the contract. We could go everywhere together. Sorry, Nora, but that's your dream, not mine. Which hurt, even more with hindsight, knowing how much before the wedding she tried to make his dream of a pub in the Oxfordshire countryside become her dream as well. Dan had always said his concern was for Nora. She'd been having panic attacks while she was in the band, especially when she got anywhere near a stage. But the concern had been at least a little manipulative now she thought about it. I thought, he was saying now, that you were starting to trust me again. Trust you? Dan, why wouldn't I trust you? You know why. Of course I know why, she lied. I just want to hear you say it. Well, since the stuff with Aaron. She stared at him like he was a Rorschach ink blot in which she saw no clear image. Aaron? The one I was speaking to tonight? Am I going to be beaten up forever about one stupid drunken moment? On the street outside, the wind was getting stronger, howling through trees as if attempting a language. This was the life she had been in mourning for. This was the life she had beaten herself up for not living. This was the timeline she thought she had regretted not existing in. One stupid mistake? She echoed. Okay, 2. It was multiplying. 2? I was in a state, the pressure of this place, and I was very drunk. You had sex with someone else, and it doesn't seem you've been seeking much atonement. Seriously, why drag all this up? We've been through this. Remember what the counselor said about focusing on where we want to go rather than where we've been? Do you ever think that maybe we just aren't right for each other? What? I love you, Dan, and you can be a very kind person, and you were great with my mom. And we used to, we have great conversations, but do you ever feel that we passed where we were meant to be, that we changed? She sat down on the edge of the bed, the furthest corner away from him. Do you ever feel lucky to have me? Do you realize how close I was to leaving you 2 days before the wedding? Do you know how messed up you would have been if I hadn't turned up at the wedding? Wow, really? You have yourself in quite high esteem there, Nora. Shouldn't I? I mean, shouldn't everyone? What's wrong with self-esteem? And besides, it's true. There's another universe where you send me WhatsApp messages about how messed up you are without me. How you turn to alcohol, though it seems like you turn to alcohol with me too. You send me texts saying you miss my voice. He made a dismissive noise somewhere between a laugh and a grunt. Well, right now I'm most definitely not missing your voice. She couldn't get beyond her shoes. She found it hard, maybe impossible, to take off another item of clothing in front of him. And stop going on about my drinking. If you were using drink as an excuse for screwing someone else, I can go on about your drinking. I'm a country landlord, scoffed Dan. It's what country landlords do. Be jovial and merry and willing to partake in the many and manifold beverages we sell. Jeez. Since when did he speak like this? Did he always speak like this? Bloody hell, Dan. He didn't even seem bothered, to seem grateful in any way for the universe he was in. The universe she'd felt so guilty for not allowing to happen. He reached for his phone, still with his laptop on the duvet. Nora watched him as he scrolled. Is this what you imagined? Is the dream working out? Nora, let's not do this heavy shit. Just get to bloody bed. Are you happy, Dan? No one's happy, Nora. Some people are. You used to be. You used to light up when you talked about this, you know, the pub before you had it. This is the life you dreamed of. You wanted me and you wanted this, and yet you've been unfaithful and you drink like a fish, and I think you only appreciate me when you don't have me, which is not a great trait to have. What about my dreams? He was hardly listening, or trying to look like he wasn't. Big fires in California, he said almost to himself. Well, at least we're not there. He put the phone down and folded his laptop. You coming to bed or what? She shrunk from him. She had shrunk for him, but he still hadn't found the space he needed. No more. Ikosagon, she told him. What? The quiz, earlier, the 20-sided polygon. Well, a 20-sided polygon is called an icosagon. I know the answer, but didn't tell you because I didn't want you to mock me. And now, I don't really care, because I don't think me knowing some things that you don't should bother you. And also, I'm going to go to the bathroom. She left Dan with his mouth open and trod gently on the wide floorboards out of the room. She reached the bathroom, switched a light on. There were tingles in her arms and legs and torso, like electric static in search of a station. She was fading out, she was sure. There wasn't long left here. The disappointment was complete. It was an impressive bathroom. There was a mirror. She gasped at her reflection. She looked healthier, but also older. Her hair made her look like a stranger. This was not the life she imagined it to be. And Nora wished the self in the mirror, good luck. The moment after that, she was back, somewhere inside the Midnight Library, and Mrs. Elm was staring at her from a small distance away with a curious smile. Well, how did it go? The penultimate update Nora had posted before she found herself between life and death. Do you ever think, how did I end up here? Like you are in a maze and totally lost, and it's all your fault because you were the one who made every turn? And you know that there are many routes that could have helped you out because you hear all the people on the outside of the maze who made it through, and they're smiling and laughing. And sometimes you get a glimpse of them through the hedge, a fleeting shape through the leaves. And they seem so damn happy to have made it, and you don't resent them. But you do resent yourself for not having their ability to work it all out. Do you? Or is this maze just for me? P.S. My cat died.